So we are going to talk about price to earnings ratios next. P ratios are very widely used in industry for relative valuation, and we have talked about price to earnings ratio earlier also when we were talking about market efficiency. So here is an example again, just to recap some of the stuff that we discussed earlier. This is the code page for Microsoft on Yahoo Finance, and here you can see the PE ratio for the company. It's currently about 30, right? So that's the PE ratio for Microsoft. And again, the way it is used in valuation is that you compare this P ratio to say the average of the industry and see if it is higher or lower, and based on that you can make a determination regarding whether the stock is undervalued or overvalued. So what we want to study today or learn today is what are the drivers of this P ratio? What are the factors that influence the P ratio? Some of the things that the investors need to be aware of when using this P ratios in their analysis. And we can rely on our dividend discount model to glean some insights about the price to earnings ratio. Okay, so uh, starting with our no growth case, right? So if you recall, the no growth scenario is this is the assumption that there is no growth rate in earnings or dividends, and therefore our dividends remain the same. All the earnings are paid out as dividends. The company is not growing, so there is no need to reinvest any earnings into the business. So all the earnings are paid out as dividends, and so the valuation is D over K, and thus dividend remains the same every year in future. So I can also write this as D1 over K or E1 over K, right? So all of those are basically same things, right? So this is the no growth case. So here we are going to write this as E1 over K. Right, because I need this earnings in my equation. So I can write the stock price as E1 over K in this no growth case, and therefore I can just divide both sides by E1, so that on the left hand side I have my PE ratio, and on the right hand side I have 1 over K. So I'm going to write it this way so that I can get my PE ratio equation. So anytime in our discussion when we talk about PE ratio, we are basically looking at this ratio here, P0 over E1, right? Current price over next year's earnings. All right. So in this no growth case, the PE ratio is simply 1 over K, right? So PE ratio is the inverse of required rate of return. Higher the K, lower is the PE ratio. So what that means is that if the firm is riskier, or if the stock is risky, K would be higher and the P ratio would be lower. So for riskier firms, the P ratio should be smaller, and for safer firms, the P ratio should be higher, other things being equal. This is again based on our no growth model, right? When we look at the constant growth model, we can again do a similar analysis to arrive at the PE equation. So our constant growth model is this, right? P0 equals D1 over K minus G. So somehow I need to bring in the earnings into this equation, right? So earnings are missing, so I need to bring in earnings into this equation. So here is how we bring the earnings into the equation. If you remember, earnings are divided into two components. We have dividends and we have retained earnings. We talked about this earlier, right? So, and retained earnings portion, we were referring to that as B, right? So, if earnings are $5 per share and my retained earnings are $2, then my B is 40%, right? So I can write my retained earnings as earnings times B, right? So I take this $5 and multiply it by 40%. That would give me retained earnings. How can I write my dividends? Dividend I can write as earnings times 1 minus B, right? 1 minus B. So B is the fraction that is retained, 1 minus b is the fraction of earnings that is paid out as dividends, right? So that's why instead of using d1 here, we can use e1 times 1 minus b, right? So again, in this example, 1 minus b would be 60%, right? B is 40% or 0.40. 1 minus b would be 0.60. So I take my earnings $5 and multiply it by 0.60, and I'll get my dividend of $3 per share, right? So that is what we are doing here. So when we write it this way, P0 equals E1 times 1 minus B. So instead of dividend, we are writing E1 times 1 minus B, and our denominator is K minus G, right? So this is that same constant growth dividend discount model, but now we have written it in terms of earnings. And now all I need to do is divide both sides by E1, and I'll get my PE ratio on the left hand side. And in this case of constant growth, what we see is that the PE ratio equals 1 minus B over K minus G, right? 1 minus B over K minus G. So that is what I have over here on the slides. P ratio written down as 1 minus B over K minus G. And again, remember G equals ROE times B. So I can also substitute G as ROE times B. Okay, so what are the factors that influence the PE ratio then? So we have again K in the denominator. Higher the K, other things being equal, lower would be the PE ratio, right? So there is an inverse relationship between K and PE ratio. So K is the required rate of return. Riskier the firm, higher would be the K and lower would be the PE ratio. What's the relationship between growth rate and PE ratio? Well, higher the G, the denominator would be smaller, right? And therefore the PE ratio would be higher. So higher the growth rate, higher would be the PE ratio. However, this is actually a conditional relationship. Remember, not all growth is good. Only that growth that adds value for the shareholders is desirable, right? Remember, we talked about the PVGO, the present value of growth opportunities. So ROE has to be greater than K for growth to be value adding, right? So only when ROE is greater than K is when the higher G is going to lead to a higher valuation and therefore higher PE ratio, right? So higher the G, as long as that growth is value adding, higher is the PE ratio. So these are important considerations, like when you're looking at companies and evaluating them for or doing the valuation using PE ratio, you need to look at their growth rates and their riskiness in order to get an accurate assessment of whether their P ratio is fair or whether they are underpriced or overpriced based on the P ratio. Okay. So couple of examples here. Again, this is the no growth case. So if your K is say 12.5%, we know that P ratio in case of no growth case, no growth scenario is just 1 over K, right? So growth rate is 12.5%, so 1 over K, meaning 1 over 0.125. So in this case the P ratio is 8, right? So this is the no growth example. Then I have also a constant growth example here. So you can see that cleanly written down over here. So in this example, B is 60%, like kind of what you had here. Up here B is sorry, here the B is 40%. In this case B is 60%, K is 12.5%, ROE is given as 15%. So what we need is 1 minus B over K minus G. So we have our B as 60%, K is 12.5%. G we can compute as the product of ROE and B. So 0.15 or 15% times 60%, and that would give us a growth rate of 9%. So once we have all the inputs, then we can compute the P ratio, right? 1 minus B over K minus G. So 1 minus 0.60 over 0.125 minus 0.09, right? And that would give us a P ratio of 11.4. So we can arrive at this same P ratio in couple of different ways. It just depends on what information is given, and that would in turn determine what is the easiest approach to actually compute this P ratio, right? So that's basically the calculation that is being done here to arrive at this P ratio of 11.4, right? So this is with the constant growth assumption. All right, so we already talked about this. What this equation is telling us is that riskier stocks with higher K are going to have a lower P ratio, and then as we also said, higher the growth rate, as long as that growth adds value, ROE is greater than K, we get this higher P ratio for higher growth rates. Okay, now since P ratios are so commonly used in industry, it is important to be aware of some of the pitfalls of P ratio. Basically, the key pitfall here is potentially the denominator here, which is the earnings. Remember, earnings can be computed differently depending on some of the assumptions, like what is the depreciation. Companies have some flexibility in using what depreciation method they want to use, and depending upon the depreciation method, the earnings can actually be different, and that can lead to a different P ratio, right? So those are kind of some of the things that companies have some flexibility in accounting, and that can lead to some sort of P ratios that are not directly comparable to industry averages and things like that. So you need to account for some of these things when you're using a P ratio. Okay, now historically you can see the relationship between P ratio and inflation rate. It's basically, I mean, as this graph is showing here, it's an inverse relationship, and same can be said about the P ratio and the interest rate, because inflation and interest rate, they tend to go hand in hand, right? So generally speaking, what we observe historically is that higher the inflation rate or interest rate, lower would be the P ratio, right? So back in the late 70s and early 80s, the inflation rate was quite high in double digits, right? And at that time, the P ratio was quite low. This is the P ratio for the market or S&P 500. And then during the financial crisis 2008 2009, interest rates were basically zero, and we saw very high P ratio valuations, right? So uh, inflation or interest rate, when they go down, P ratios, they tend to go up. There's an inverse relationship, and we are kind of seeing that right now as well. P ratios are at an elevated level, and interest rates are basically at a very low level, right? We have been in this low interest rate environment for quite some time, and therefore the P ratios have been elevated. Basically, the lower interest rates lead to higher valuations, because in your valuation equation, the interest rates or the discount rates, they go in the denominator. Okay. Then when you look at the P ratios across industries, again, this is where we can very clearly see the impact of growth rates on P ratios, right? So high growth industries like biotech or software and so on, they tend to have higher P ratios, right? So again, higher the growth rate, higher the P ratio. And low growth companies, defense or utilities and those type of companies, they are not growing at such a rapid pace, so their low growth translates into lower P ratios for those industries, right? So when we look at P ratios across industries, again we can see that there is that direct impact of growth rate on P ratio. Okay, and then here alongside P ratio for S&P 500, we also have price to sales ratio, price to cash flow ratio, and what this chart here is showing basically is that all of those ratios, they tend to be very highly correlated, right? So sometimes you cannot use P ratios. Like if the firm has negative earnings, right, then the P ratio would be meaningless in that case. So in those cases, you would have to resort to uh, other ratios, and you can use something like price to sales ratio or price to cash flow ratio for your valuation. Okay, and again, at least for the overall market, what this is showing is that all of these ratios, they tend to be very highly correlated.